everyone, tonight's video is on plant evolution to land and the adaptations that plants needed to evolve in order to move from an aquatic environment to a dry land environment. We're also going to go through examples of the different plants as they acquired these different adaptations. So we will talk about moss, and then we'll talk about fern, and then we're going to talk about gymnosperms or our conifers, these are our pine trees, and finally we're going to talk about angiosperm or our flowering plants. So once upon a time, life existed only in the oceans. There wasn't any soil on dry land, there was only rocks. Soil is composed of decaying plant material, and there were no land plants. The only plants were in the ocean. So those original sea plants were very primitive. I have some examples here of what these sea plants might have looked like. Of course, we don't have any living examples of what these prehistoric plants would have looked like, but they likely would have been small, mainly single-cellular, photosynthetic organisms. They didn't need to store water. They were surrounded by it. And they didn't need a vascular system to deliver water to cells. As I said, they were very small, a maximum of only 2 cells thick. So even in a multicellular prehistoric plant, at least one side was exposed to water, so they could get water by osmosis directly through their cell membrane. These plants also didn't need roots. The function of roots is to absorb water by osmosis from the ground so that it can be transported to the rest of the plant. And of course, these plants were surrounded by water. These plants didn't need to be able to support themselves or stand up. The water pressure in the aquatic environment kept the plants in the correct structure and position. Finally, the male gamete had to swim to the female gamete. So what happens when this primitive plant moves to land? What adaptations is this plant going to need in order to be able to survive? Well, it's going to need to have a way to stay hydrated because this original plant was surrounded by water, but on land it wouldn't be surrounded by water and it would quickly dehydrate. They would also need to be able to grow upright. They need a way to support themselves without the pressure of the water around them. Land plants need roots to absorb water from the ground because they're no longer surrounded by water. And then they need a vascular system, and this vascular system would deliver the water from the ground up to the rest of the plant, and it would also deliver the sugars that are made by photosynthesis in the leaves to the rest of the plant. Finally, the male gamete needs to be able to find the female gamete without swimming. So let's start with these adaptations one at a time. First of all, land plants need a way to stay hydrated. You can see here I have a picture of a lettuce leaf, and there's a few drops of water on it. And these dropper drops are balled up. They're not absorbing into the leaf, and that's because this leaf is covered by something called a cuticle, which is a waxy coating on the entire plant surface. This prevents dehydration. This forbids water from coming out of the plant. It also keeps water from going into the leaf of the plant. But what problem could you foresee with a waterproof covering on the entire plant? Well, plants need to be able to exchange gases. They need to be able to allow carbon dioxide to go in for the carbon donor for photosynthesis, and they need oxygen to be able to go out because this is a waste product of photosynthesis. So plants have an adaptation. If they have a cuticle, they also have something called a stomata. So let's look over here at this picture. This is a picture taken down a light microscope of a plant leaf, and you can see the outline of the very boxy plant cells here. And then you can see this additional structure that almost looks like a mouth. This is a stomata. It's a pore in the leaf that allows for gas exchange. And plants can regulate their opening or closing, so when they need to let oxygen out and carbon dioxide in, they can open their stomata. But if they happen to be in a very warm, dry environment, and want to keep their stomata closed so they don't lose too much water, they can do that too. So land plants need a cuticle to prevent water loss and stomata to allow for gas exchange. If a plant has a cuticle, it has to have stomata. Land plants also need vascular tissue that provides both structural support so that the plant can grow upright and tall, and a way to deliver water from the roots all the way up through to the top of the plant to the leaves where it can be an electron donor for photosynthesis. This vascular system also has to deliver the sugars that are made by photosynthesis in the leaves to the rest of the plant. So the first land plant that had any of these adaptations is the moss. So you can see here this moss on a rock. Moss has a cuticle, which is that waxy coating to keep it hydrated so it doesn't dry out. And of course with a cuticle, moss also have stomata to allow for gas exchange. Moss have these tiny root-like structures to hold on to surfaces, but they can't absorb water from the ground, so they aren't real, true roots. Moss also lack a vascular system to allow it to support itself and grow tall, and to transport sugars around the plant and to transport water around the plant. Most importantly, the male gamete must still swim to the female gametes. So moss is only found in very moist environments, both because the male gamete must swim and because it lacks a vascular system. So we typically see moss in a shady location that don't dry out, and moss plants are typically very small. They can't grow tall without that vascular system. The next big step in plant evolution are the ferns. You can see a picture here of a fern leaf. Fern have a cuticle and a stomata, and they have true roots, so they can absorb water from the ground. In addition to the cuticle, stomata, true roots, ferns have a vascular system that not only transport water and sugars, but it also allows them to support themselves and grow upright. So ferns are larger than moss. The veins that you see in a leaf here are bundles of the two components of the vascular system that transport both water and sugars. Now, ferns are still limited to moist environments because the male gamete still has to swim to the female gamete. Like moss, typically we see ferns in shady locations that do not dry out. The land plants we've discussed so far have been able to live on land due to their cuticle, stomata, and then in the case of the fern, they have vascular systems and roots that allow them to transport the water and sugars to the rest of the plant and allows them to grow upright. But they've been limited to very moist environments because the male gamete's only capable of moving to the female gamete by swimming. So two major adaptations occurred about 360 million years ago that allow plants to live far from water, as this desert cactus is pictured here. And those are pollen and seeds. So we're going to talk about these individually. So the first adaptation I want to talk about is pollen, and that's the male gamete. So in the form of pollen, the male gamete can reach the female gamete by blowing in the wind. You can see in this photograph here, these are pollen grains that are being blown from this flower. And those pollen grains are the male gamete in search of a female gamete to fertilize. Plants with pollen don't need to be in a moist environment to fertilize and reproduce. And this was a huge adaptation that allowed plants to move far inland, away from moist environments. Seeds are the second adaptation that evolved 360 million years ago. Seeds are embryonic plants inside a seed coat. Seeds allow plant embryos to wait until the conditions, such as temperature and moisture, are favorable for further development. So let's look at an example of a seed. We have here a peanut, which is coated in a shell, and then inside this peanut shell are two peanuts, which have another layer called a seed coat. And if you're eating your peanuts, you have to peel that seed coat off. The seed coat is a protective coating. It allows the embryo to wait until the conditions, like I said, primarily temperature and water, are appropriate for development. So seeds mean that the embryo can wait for rain to come before it starts to develop. And it means that the embryo can wait for the snow to melt. It can wait for warmer temperatures before starting to develop. Let's look inside what a seed actually looks like. So here's a peanuts that have been broken open in half. And you can see that this large area here is what we call an endosperm. It's nutrition for aerobic respiration. Seeds, of course, are generally underground, and an emerging plant doesn't do photosynthesis until it's above ground. So when a plant is first starting to grow, it does aerobic respiration to make ATP, and its nutrition source for this aerobic respiration is this endosperm, these sugars that are located in the seed. The other part of the seed is the actual embryo of the plant, which you can see right here. An embryo is in suspended animation in the seeds. It's started to develop and then stopped, and it's waiting. is waiting to grow until the conditions of temperature and moisture are correct. And then when it does start to grow, it will use the sugars in the endosperm and do aerobic respiration to make ATP until it grows above ground and it has access to light to do photosynthesis. So what's an example of a plant with a cuticle, stomata, roots, a vascular system, and pollen and seeds? Well, that's what we call our gymnosperm, our conifers. You can think of them as pine trees. That's the simplest example. Pine trees have both male and female pine cones. The male pine cone is very small, as you can see here. Look at the size relative to the size of one individual pine little stem there. You can see when the wind blows, the pollen from this male gamete is blown, and it is blown and is hoping to land on a female gamete. The female gamete is found in the female pine cone. The female pine cone is much larger, and you can see each of the scales in this female pine cone has a spot for 2 seeds. These are the individual pine seeds that live on the female pine cone. Once the female gamete is fertilized by the blowing male pollen, the male gamete, it begins to develop, and then it's encased in a seed coat with an endosperm before stopping development to wait for the correct conditions to germinate or begin to grow. Now, is it energetically efficient for plants to make enough pollen to cover every possible surface in the hope that one pollen grain will find one seed? And look at this. You can see how much pollen each gymnosperm has to make in the hopes that they can fertilize a single female gamete. Could pollen be transferred to the seed more efficiently? And the answer is yes, and that's our final, most highly evolved plant, and that's the angiosperm, our flowering plants. Flowers are an adaptation to entice animals to move pollen directly from the male part to the female part of the plant. And we will talk about this more in class. So you should know the different adaptations to land that each of the following plants has: the moss, the fern, the gymnosperm, and the angiosperm. And you should know how each adaptation allowed these types of plants to move from water to land. So that's all for tonight.